Welcome to the Wednesday, December 28th, December 29th edition. Right, I guess I'm back in Halloween. December 29th edition of Going Wild News. My name is Jim Dingeman. We're joined in California with Ken Aaron, and we have in Long Island Steve Janos, in New Jersey Dennis Goldstein, in Queens Michael Jankowitz, myself. I'm in the Bronx right now. But let's get into some of the headlines today. We had a decision, I believe, in the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell today. She was found guilty in the sex trafficking scandal dealing with Mr. Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, although we have not seen any kind of further elaboration of Prince Andrew's involvement or President Clinton's involvement or President Trump's involvement, etc. So who knows where that's going to go. Now, it turns out that the latest mass murder rampage in Denver, the person who killed 5 of the people in the shooting rampage, this was personal. He knew the victims. So we have another example of madness and craziness in America, where some guy decided to go nuts in Denver and kill a bunch of innocent people. And that
with easy access to guns.
Right, with easy access to guns. Biden is now, and we can talk about this coming out of this, Biden's talking about Putin. So we still have this situation in Ukraine, although supposedly the Russians have stood down some of the forces there. I don't know the military situation. I haven't looked at it carefully, but that crisis is, quote, still going on. The United States has decided to maintain a carrier assault group in the Mediterranean, and we'll see and keep on top of that. Now, global warming, of course, just keeps on going on with its disastrous consequences. Alaska today set a record high December temperature of 19.4 degrees centigrade, which I believe is in the 70s. And so yesterday it was 67, another high for Alaska. And so global warming just keeps on trending on as we speak. Now, in terms of the coronavirus crisis, COVID set a new record for daily cases in the United States. This was a huge surge in the United States today. I think today was the largest surge since January or March of last year. I could be wrong. I think it was almost 267,000 cases in a 7-day average were exceeded yesterday on Tuesday. So again, we could stand corrected, but it is my understanding that this is some of the highest amounts of COVID cases in the recorded at this point. And the whole question of who is fully vaccinated, who isn't. I know there's controversy with the CDC, with the various rulings they came out with. You've also seen a rise of, I think there was a 75% rise of children who were affected by Omicron. And we have in New York City still staggering lines for all the and there's over 110,000 people have tested positive since Christmas. So Omicron keeps on going on. And we also have infection records being set in Europe. Now, before we continue other stories, I wanted to get Steve's input into this. Steve, what's your opinion about what we're seeing right now?
Well, I think we are seeing in this country, we're seeing somewhere between 3 to 4 different epidemics. One is an epidemic of the COVID-19, of the virus, which itself has several subsets. Delta, I think, is probably still around, but we have this new variant called Omicron, which everybody is aware of. It hasn't been around long enough, I don't believe, for the virologists and the environmental scientists, epidemiological, infectious disease epidemiologists to get a complete understanding of what is going on with Omicron. And I think that is what leads to the confusing, somewhat confusing federal government policy that came out between yesterday and today. And I think Dr. Walensky is putting the best possible face on this, in the context of nobody has a complete understanding of how this particular variant operates in the environment and in the human environment, and also in the non-human physical environment. However, this country, unlike virtually every other country, has several complicating factors which make dealing with the epidemic much more difficult for both public health policy, and that's public health policy, which starts with the CDC, with healthcare policy, which starts with the hospital system, and healthcare policy, which starts with the hospital system, and then the the individual practice of medicine, and of course that's the political aspect of it. The Republican Party has used this epidemic politically in a variety of ways from the very beginning. I mean, if you remember back in February of 2020, when then President Trump knew exactly what was going on. I was very surprised when that recording of his conversation with
Woodward, with Bob Woodward, with Bob Woodward.
Bob, thank you. I was getting to Bob. At least I was getting to Bob. With Bob Woodward came out. I was surprised by two things. Well, I was really surprised that Trump actually understood what the nature of the disease was, that it was highly transmissible, was transmitted from person to person, and that it would develop, exponentially, although he didn't use that term because he probably doesn't understand what it means. But at the same time, that contrasted with what he was saying publicly. And I remember that particular month, I watched him and Hannity saying there's nothing to see here. It's 6 cases now. It's going to go down to nothing. And remember when Trump didn't want people to be disembarked from a cruise ship because that would make the numbers go up here. So there's been this political aspect of the whole thing, and I think I would say it's a political device. Describe it as a political epidemic, negative, obviously, epidemics are negative, that has been with us from the beginning, which has gone through various phases. But what we have now is the Republican interference with the most important public health measure that could be taken, and that is mass vaccination. Does that mean that everybody who gets vaccinated is not going to be a transmitter? No. Does it mean that everybody who is vaccinated will not get some version of COVID-19? No. What it does mean, and we see that in the comparison between the states that are Democratic and the states that are Republican, is that you have a much lower incidence of the disease and of infectivity among people who are vaccinated. The third aspect, and that's been made political, and it still is. I mean, it's very massively political in Republican states. There's this little screaming left-wing element that I happen to see on a particular listserv that I'm on, which shall remain nameless, that supports this view. And this says that vaccination is bad. It also says that a mandate for vaccination, it implies, it never says, because I think most of the people who write on this thing know the difference between a mandate, what mandate in the context of the pandemic means, what it really means, but they make it out to mean forced vaccination. Nobody in the public health community would ever support forced vaccination. What mandate means, and it should, the word mandate should never have been introduced into the vocabulary in this situation. And Ken and Jim, when I've gone on long enough, please tell me you've gone on.
Oh, go on, Steve.
Okay. The term should have been requirement. A requirement to do certain things, a requirement to get vaccinated to work in certain kinds of jobs. a requirement to get vaccinated to be in certain kinds of places, like on airplanes, for example. The word should have been requirement. We have the word mandate, but we in public health do not use the term mandate to mean forced vaccination. That is entirely unethical. It's entirely unethical. But mandated vaccinations are entirely in the tradition of vaccinations in this country. We've had mandated vaccinations for decades, primarily for school children. Anybody who's had kids, and even a lot of people who don't have kids, know that there's a whole bunch of vaccinations that kids have to have that are mandated if those kids are to go to school. There are certain communities, like there is an Orthodox Jewish community to the northwest of New York City, which does not believe in vaccination. Fine, they've set up their own school system. So if measles got into that particular school system, it would wreak havoc. But presumably they try to use other methods to prevent their one or more of their children from getting infected with measles. They don't believe in vaccination, but they're not exposing themselves or anybody else in a public school system to vaccination. I've used the following example before when we talk about, well, people should have the freedom not to be vaccinated. Yes, they do have the freedom not to be vaccinated. They don't have to be vaccinated, but they can be required to be vaccinated, as I said before, in certain to do certain things and engage in certain behaviors. I mean, for example, somebody might, says, well, I have the freedom not to be vaccinated, which means I have the freedom to get sick, to put an additional burden on an already overloaded hospital system, to become more infectious for my neighbors because it makes me feel good. Well, why don't we say then, if it would make you feel good to defecate into a public water supply, you should be allowed to defecate into a public water supply. It's a perfect equivalent. That's what we're talking about. So we have these sort of 2.5 epidemics: the epidemic of the disease, the epidemic of a politically run program that is intended to make it as difficult as possible for a Democratic administration to be effective. They want to make Joe Biden look bad. They want to make him look as bad as they can, which is why they're doing what they're doing. Primarily, secondarily, they bring along the people who have very unscientific ideas about the epidemic. So, and then there's this sort of little side epidemic of left-wingers who if you read their stuff, and I read the first few sentences and I can't go any further, but they have a great feeling of self-importance. They're absolutely sure they're right. They are also absolutely sure that the vaccines that have been developed 15 years from now are going to induce some very negative effects on the recipients. How exactly they figure that out for something that they're projecting would happen 15 years from now, I don't know, but I would love to hear them tell us. Let me make one more comment about vaccines. I'm sure, well, not I'm sure, those folks who watch MSNBC very frequently see a Dr. Hotez, H-O-T-E-Z, from Texas. He's at Baylor. He's the director of their vaccine program. He has been for several decades, and several other, he's the dean of the School of Public Health there. He also has mastered not sleeping, which I think would be very good. He could really share that skill with us. They have developed independently a vaccine which is based on an old technology, not on out of the new mRNA technology, in cooperation with a series of non-Western countries. They are in the process of distributing over 1 billion doses of this vaccine. The countries like India, Bangladesh, Malaysia. When he was on this morning talking about this on Morning Joe, nobody asked him, well, what's happening here with your vaccine? And I'm sure that was one of the conditions that Dr. Hotez imposed in advance, because the answer to that question could be very, very embarrassing to this administration. I think the Biden administration is doing the best it can in a very complicated situation. But I would love to know what the reasons are that this non-mRNA vaccine, which has been produced and evaluated by Dr. Hotez's laboratory, is not being introduced widely in the United States. And I'll stop there.
All right. Well, we've been talking with Steve Janos about the latest in the Omicron and COVID-19 situation. You're listening to Going Viral News. My name is Jim Dingeman. We are joined on the air with Ken Aaron in California, Dennis Goldstein and Michael Jankowitz, and Steve Janos and myself, Jim Dingeman, here in the New York City area. And we're just talking initially about the latest in the Omicron and COVID-19 nightmare that we're all living through. I did have a conversation with a friend of mine who came back from Florida, and he told me, and he is masked up, he's vaccinated, he's boosted. He told me he actually had physical fights down there with people who are anti-vaxxers. So this is what's sort of the issue of the misinformation, misperceptions that goes out, I think is very important. And to me, you just have to have common sense about what is scientifically accurate or not. That to me is the key question in this. But let's move on to other stories. Now, today, or actually yesterday, Brian Stetler, Kenny's been asking me let's go over what are the 10 top stories of the year. And this is Stetler talking about the 10 top media stories. So let me just play what he has to say. This is on CNN a few days ago.
Number 10, deplatforming Donald Trump. Twitter permanently banning the president just days after the Capitol insurrection, while Facebook gave him a timeout.
Our breaking news this hour, Facebook says former President Donald Trump will not be allowed back on its platforms until at least January 7th, 2023.
While Trump cries censorship, social media CEOs are just trying to figure out where to draw the line. Number 9, TV news turnover. Chris Cuomo out at CNN after text messages showed how he helped his governor brother fight sexual harassment allegations. Now both Cuomos are out of jobs. Soon, the 9 p.m. time slot at MSNBC is in for a change too, with Rachel Maddow renewing her contract but expanding into documentaries and preparing to leave her daily hour. MSNBC also needs to replace Brian Williams, who signed off in December with a warning.
For the first time in my 62 years, my biggest worry is for my country.
And over at Fox, a very different departure. Lou Dobbs ousted without explanation, but it happened 24 hours after he was named in a defamation lawsuit. At the end of the year, Chris Wallace announced he was leaving Fox on his own terms. He's joining CNN and its forthcoming streaming service. Number 8, Oprah's Bombshell interview with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The revelations shook the royal family, with the Duchess of Sussex citing the family's, quote, concerns about baby Archie's skin color. She said she felt so alone, she contemplated suicide.
I just didn't want to be alive anymore.
Fallout from the interview rippled across the media, and when a co-anchor called out Piers Morgan for his anti-Meghan rants, he stormed off the set of his British morning show.
You continue to trash her.
Okay, I'm done with this.
No.
Sorry, no. Sorry.
Do you know what? That's pathetic.
You can trash me, maybe not my
No.
See you later.
I'm being...
Sorry, can't do this.
This is absolutely diabolical behavior.
He then left the network. As for Harry and Meghan, they are now making podcasts and TV shows, which leads me to number 7, the streaming wars. Hollywood giants are trying to get even bigger, investing more and more in streaming series to keep you subscribed. Streaming is the focus of AT&T's deal to spin off Warner Media, including CNN, and combine it with Discovery. If okayed by regulators, the new standalone company will take shape in mid-2022, going head-to-head with Netflix and Disney. In 2021, shows like Squid Game and Ted Lasso won attention and awards. And studios kept experimenting by putting movies like Black Widow both on streaming and in theaters at the same time. When Disney did that, Scarlett Johansson shocked Hollywood by suing for breach of contract, showing that the rules are being rewritten every day. Number 6, daring reporting from Afghanistan. As the Taliban encroached on Kabul and the U.S. withdrawal turned chaotic, reporters became the eyes and ears of the world.
They've just told me to stand to the side because I'm a woman.
CNN's Clarissa Ward documented the Taliban's takeover despite all the uncertainty and earned praise from fellow journalists. Behind the scenes, Ward and hundreds of others worked to evacuate endangered reporters, assistants, drivers, and other Afghans who worked with Western media. The local reporters who remain there face a hostile climate. Which brings me to number 5, the continuing crackdown on global press freedom. In Hong Kong, police raided a pro-democracy newspaper in June, arresting top editors. A month before that, this incident shocked the world. A dissident Belarusian journalist arrested after his commercial flight was forced down in essentially a state-sponsored hijacking.
Have we seen anything like this before?
No, is the short answer.
Countries around the world are rolling back the rights of reporters in sometimes brazen ways. The Committee to Protect Journalists says a record high number of reporters are behind bars now, with China being the worst jailer. Number 4, the woke wars. It's an awakening over racial and social injustice to some, but an overreaction to others. Is it cancel culture or consequence culture? And whatever it's called, has it gone too far? These debates raged across media all year.
It will eventually get to straight white men are not allowed to talk.
This is called a purge. It's a mentality that belongs in Stalin's Russia.
Canceling Dr. Seuss isn't stupid, it's intentional.
Of course, Dr. Seuss wasn't canceled. His legacy company simply decided to stop publishing a few titles that had racist imagery. But free speech issues are real, and alternatives are emerging for people who want to bypass traditional book publishers, newspapers, and other gatekeepers. Writers are flocking to Substack and launching newsletters, a new model that brings fresh debates over free speech. Number 3, January 6th, denialism. The big lie about Trump winning the election led to the big deny, desperate attempts to erase the violent reality of the riot.
You see people walking around and taking pictures. They don't look like terrorists, they look like tourists.
That's Fox's highest rated star trying to rewrite history. While commentators stoke conspiracy theories, right-wing media barely covers the real news about the insurrection's aftermath or the new efforts to subvert democracy at the state level. What we are losing in America is a sense of shared reality. But the big lie may cost its crusaders.
Breaking just a short time ago, Fox facing a $1.6 billion lawsuit accused of spreading election lies.
And that was just the beginning. 2 voting tech companies have filed multiple defamation suits against Fox News and other networks. And a series of blockbuster books continue to reveal what really happened during Trump's final days in the White House. Number 2, the Facebook reckoning. A whistleblower was heard around the world, first through the Facebook files, a series of Wall Street Journal stories based on leaks from inside Facebook. Then the source, Frances Haugen, stepped forward.
I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people.
Haugen alleged that the company's own research showed its platforms can be toxic for children and society writ large, but that the company failed to take action. CEO Mark Zuckerberg pushed back, saying many of her claims didn't make sense. But Haugen gave new momentum to governments that want to rein in social media. Anti-social media was a through line for the entire year, bringing us to the #1 media story of 2021. The vaccine disinformation divide. Reliable info about COVID-19 vaccines helped people get vaxxed and protected. But anti-vax lies and distortions went viral from Facebook to Fox in ways that worsened the pandemic's terrible toll. The right-wing media machine took conspiracy theories from the fringes and moved them to the mainstream.
Radical left-wing fanatics who are bent on forcing each and every American to get themselves injected with an experimental, unproven drug.
Fox News demonized Dr. Anthony Fauci.
This is what people say to me, that he doesn't represent science to them. He represents Joseph Mengele.
And the anti-science rhetoric cost lives. Several right-wing radio hosts who resisted vaccines died of COVID. TV stars who claimed to respect their audience actually put them at risk. Big tech platforms said they tried to clean up the garbage, but the vaccine divide is a sad reflection of a choose-your-own-news culture. It's incumbent on everyone to choose carefully. Brian Stelter, CNN, New York.
All right, so there's a lot there to bite. I just wanted to throw in, of course, we were talking earlier about this information issue. I wanted to throw in, just for a little gravy on top, this is an op-ed piece by Robert Reich, and he's referring, of course, to January 6th, which I believe Brian also mentioned, and that was the media top 10 stories. Obviously, people may have top 10 stories that are aside from the media. Absolutely, I'm sure COVID, January 6th, these are one of the top stories in the United States, of course, and around certainly COVID around the world. And January 6th is quite, still raging with us because of the kind of things we're going to see happening this year politically. And the January 6th committee is still underway. They're still subpoenaing people. And this is basically something I agree with Robert Reich. Trump incited the attack on the Capitol. He also actually, I felt he started before the election, preparing the electorate for the idea that the election should be reversed. If I recall, he started to talk about this when he started to declare that the voting system is fraudulent and illegal. He started that way before the aftermath of the election in 2020. And this other point, the coup continues. We're still facing this. We all know that the GOP looks like it's going to take control of the House and Senate in 2022. And they're again morphing this. This misinformation campaign on that is quite intense. And the issue of exposing a deeper problem, which America may heal, we can always have all sorts of interpretations of that. But I just wanted to share that. But anyway, let's get some reactions.
Stelter report. I saw something different than what Ken saw. I saw him attempt to illustrate what, in his view, were the top 10 media stories of the year. And very frankly, I don't remember all of them. I guess I should have written them down as he said them. Obviously, one of the top stories was the pandemic. Another top story was January 6th and its aftermath. Another top story, as far as the media is concerned, was the Epstein trial. Well, not Epstein, Maxwell. I think he also mentioned the Royals. He did mention he feels that the Chris Cuomo story was a lot more significant than Ken thinks it is. Ken thinks it's a political commentary. What Stetler and I think that the Chris Cuomo story is about ethics. That it turned out that at the same time that Chris Cuomo was consulting with his brother behind the scenes on how to deal with the oncoming set of accusations, at the same time he was doing that, he was appearing on the air for CNN, simply reporting, what was going on. I think I see that as a conflict of interest. Maybe it wasn't. I would hope that if I were in Chris Cuomo's position, I wouldn't do the same thing. So I think that, as I say, I don't remember everything that was on the list for Brian's top media stories. Ken and I certainly disagree about the politics, about the importance of the insurrection and so on and so forth. But in terms of the the program that we saw with Brian Stetler, I have a different interpretation of that too, that he was simply saying, these are the 10 most important media stories of the year.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're joined with Matthew Reiss. Matthew is a former reporter for the New York Times and Village Voice. Matthew, can you unmute? Matthew, you there? You have to unmute, Matthew.
Gotcha. I'm off the mute.
Okay. Well, we were just talking about the news stories of the year. We had played a piece by Brian Stetler as you were coming in. He was focusing in on what he felt were the media stories of the year. But I guess I would ask you both, like, what do you think are the most important stories of the year and also media stories combined? What is your opinion, Matthew?
Well, without time to prepare, it's going to be just what I recall. But my first thought on the general question is the media stories of the year were not reported. It's actually when I but let me go back just a couple of paragraphs in the conversation, because there was something that talking about the media outlets that you were mentioning. I met a journalist from a newspaper called Taz in Germany, a paper that I visited in Berlin years ago, and I had a friend who was writing for them out of the USSR when there was a USSR. And I got to talking with the US correspondent, and I made some reference to the Village Voice and some of the work that I did there in the day when there was a Village Voice, before it became the Breitbart Voice that it is right now. I was waiting to hear back to her, because I told her that I'd fill her in, and because she said her editors were telling her, why don't you write about what happened to the Village Voice? And I said, well, it was captured by an entity that I would tie back to what I call Breitbart University. It's called Chapman, I believe it's called Chapman University out in Orange County, California, where Mr. Breitbart was given some kind of award for his scholarly work back around, I think it was 2007. Well, there was a bit of a what's the term? It's a piracy term. Basically, the LA Weekly, which had been a part of the Village Voice Corporation up until a certain year, I don't have the details, but a group led by this guy from Breitbart University came in and purchased the LA Weekly. They wouldn't say who the members of the corporation that bought it were, and they laid off everybody but every journal, I believe everybody but one guy in the production department, who is now their only writer, and they use it for purposes of, they had used it for purposes of promoting other areas that these investors, these right-wing investors, were involved with. Some of it was cannabis, but in any case, the story then shifts to New York City, because it was approximately, was it 2015, if my numbers are correct, that an entity called, what's his name? Peter. Well, I'll come back to Breitbart if there's a question. I'll be happy to address it. But a guy by the name of Peter Barbie, no relation to Klaus Barbie, came in and purchased the Village Voice. I believe it was 2015, and all of the newspapers were gushing that this guy, whose ancestors created a newspaper in Reading, Pennsylvania 200 years ago, was coming in and was going to insert some journalistic, God knows what, mojo, I suppose is the proper term in the old English language. And and he proceeded to allow it to operate for a short period, and then it went. It was no longer paper; it was just online. And then he literally took out a shovel and buried it 6 feet under. And this was an odd thing because the logo, Village Voice, is of immense value. There's been very few publications that made such a splash on American culture and held it for so many years. And over those years, there was journalism being done. I would characterize that practice as where you question authority and then print it. I'll come back to that concept when dealing with the other publications that existed in the last 20 or 30 years that used to do that as well. In any case, Barbie buried it and did not sell the logo to the company to anyone else. He just took it off the market. At the same time, the Breitbart legacy people came in and took down the LA Weekly and turned it into a skeleton of itself with no, with almost no journalism whatsoever. They would just repurpose other material and promote their products that these owners, these new owners had. And basically, the staff over there that was let go, they kind of went after this guy. The name of this, the guy who was the figurehead publisher at LA Weekly is a guy named Calley, Brian Calley. And eventually, and basically everybody in Orange County from LA across the region was pissed off that the LA Weekly was no more. People used to pick it up, much like The Voice, read it before they went out, decide what to do, get some ideas. I'm not terribly familiar with it, but I knew it existed. And so a couple of years went by and people stopped asking what happened to The Voice? Why isn't there a voice? Well, you know, and I believe that Barbie was throwing old content up once in a while from his operation, and it was a skeleton staff, or perhaps nothing at all. I think it literally went went dark. And so the next sound we hear in regard to this phenomenon was I don't even remember where I heard the first report. The Village Voice has been sold to another entity that used to be at the LA Weekly. Well, if you read the New York Times story about the purchase of the Village Voice by Calley's group, you would never have known that this guy was one of these. How do you characterize the right wing in America? It's very hard because that includes the Democratic Party and it includes the Republican Party. And so it's the kind of thing we would refer to in our local dialect as right-wing nuts. These guys were, you know, it wasn't like the guys that are on the New York Times editorial list like Brooks and etc. who came right out of Buckley's various publications, etc., which is right-wing stuff. These guys were sloppy right-wing types. Anyway, the Times reported that this guy Calley came in and purchased it from Barbie and has since resuscitated it, in the words of one of the former LA Weekly people, with a staff, none of whom, basically, nobody would have the temerity to go on and put their name onto this sheet, whatever you want to call this sheet, because there's really nothing there. I read the last couple of issues, and you could completely ignore it and know exactly the same amount of content.
Well,
And,
Matthew, let me just interrupt you for a second. You know, what does strike me with all this is that, you know, we're seeing once again, you know, the general trends in what you've just described in detail of the destruction of alternative media and local news coverage around the country. But let me just hold off a second.
I just want to ask Matthew a curiosity follow-up question. Matthew, what do you think of the Atlantic and the New York Times and Time Magazine and U.S. News and World Report. I don't know if those last two are still in print. Time must be, but with the Atlantic and the New York Times.
Well, if you'd be kind enough to allow me to address what Jim just said and then come to you.
Okay.
Jim mentioned alternative media and local reporting. Well, after my conversation with the woman from Germany, I decided not to wait for her, and I did a deep dive, and I took a look at whether or not every so-called left or liberal publication in the United States, including those that I've worked for in the past, have basically been bought off by a process we know as the National, what was it called? The National Security Act of 1947. And basically that was the system through which all of the so-called alternative press have died a dog's death and do not exist in any sense of the word now, if we use the measurement of questioning authority. They do not question authority. They kind of assuage it. And that goes for Mother Jones, and that goes for In These Times, and that goes for The Progressive, and it goes for in spades The Nation, and on and on and on. If you think of any, they're basically all basically living off grants coming from either the Ford Foundation or Bill Moyer's Foundation or etc. There's a few of them, but really it's the Ford Foundation that invented this phenomenon when the CIA pumped a bunch of money into it, and the Ford Foundation created the National Student Association, and basically politics on the earth tends to take place. You get young people through student politics, and then they eventually get some skills and go into professional politics. Well, we don't have that in the United States because the Central Intelligence Agency created student politics as we know it, and the successor of the National Student Association is called the United States Student Association, which is basically the Democratic Party. Now, let me get, okay, I mentioned these 3 or 4 entities that used to do journalism, and then money just got pumped in one way or the other, some, outright bribes to alter stories and things of this nature. And now, if I may, let me hit the Times, the Atlantic, and what was it, U.S. News? I haven't seen hide nor hair of U.S. News. They seem to put out an issue to say who are the best doctors, what's the best university, who makes the only single flush toilet, that kind of thing. Okay. But we do have the Atlantic. The Atlantic was the home of, what's his name, Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Mr. Coates is his basic, his beat was telling black people that they should band together and not do any organizing or something like that. I think they call it identity politics, which is basically the opposite of class politics. And as long as, and basically, that he was the prized pig over there for quite a number of years. That's one example. I know there's a good journalist, used to work at Nader's operation in the 80s, who's an editor there, but the content that comes out of the Atlantic, well, the Atlantic got an investor about 8 or 10 years ago, and their big property was the Atlantic Online. And basically it altered the concept of this old important magazine into what I dare say is not really important. They're not going to do any journalism. They're not going to ask hard questions. But because the name Atlantic there is, it still sells a few tickets. But the New York Times is the best example of all of this, because I mean, if you read about who created the New York Times, they said that the official record is that some investor hunted down some guy in North Carolina was it Oaks or Sulzberger? I don't remember. I think it was Oaks family, and and they took over this big broadsheet that and basically pumped money into it, and they undercharged for advertising, and it knocked off a large number of the dozen or so daily papers that New York used to have. But my reading of, I'm trying to remember the author. There was a film made about him called "Tell the Truth and Run." Does anyone recall this ancient author? Anyway, I got 5 of his books behind me, about 6 feet. We'll get back to him, but a very important author of who basically wrote about media back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and actually inspired I.F. Stone to create his one-man job paper around the late 60s as well. Well, he is the source for my reading that J.P. Morgan created the current phenomenon, the current iteration of the New York Times. And that was specifically for the purpose of getting the United States into World War I, because Morgan had loaned a lot of money to the French for weapons, and he wouldn't have got paid back if there was no war. So that's the starting point. More recently, the New York Times, give me a moment. Now, when I was working there, back around 98 through about 2002, I was just freelancing, but eventually I would start proposing articles that were a little more substantive than covering small businesses in immigrant neighborhoods for the Sunday insert. And let's see, I'll give you an idea of the articles that I proposed. I think it's significant. I wouldn't tell you if it wasn't. On the Thursday after 9/11, I called my editor after talking to the EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the DEC, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, and the City Department of Environmental Protection. And my conversation with each of them was, is there anything in the air that could be dangerous? All 3 of them gave me contradictory information that contradicted the other 2. So we knew that it was false. We knew that the thesis was valid, and they didn't go for the story. And as one person put it, of course they didn't print that because downtown real estate would lose its shirt. And I will quote, what's his name? Seymour Hersh, who once in a while has something intelligent to say, when he said, the New York Times is a real estate company. Back when I was teaching at Rutgers and he came to speak. So we have a real estate company, basically. Another thing we should know about the New York Times is that in the words of the guy who ran the Clinton's Korea desk at the State Department, he told me the way it works is the White House calls down to David Sanger. David Sanger was or is the Times lead reporter for the last 20 years. They call Sanger, they bring him in, and they dictate the headline for the next day. Let's see, one last quote perhaps, or one last example regarding the Times and what to expect from it now. I was writing a story about the privatization of the public education system, and I managed to get some interesting details about one principal down in Washington Irving High School who was trying to privatize the school, turn it into a charter school, and sell the air rights over the school. And when I brought it to one editor who I knew there, I'll not mention his name at this juncture, and another, and together with the education editor at the time, this is around 2003, I guess, and I said, look, what's going on here is it characterizes the charter, all of the charter schools. It's all for profit, and they're sucking money out of the public education system. And this is just a documented example of how this takes place. And They tried to talk me into changing the angle on that. I walk, and then they hand me some guy to work with who tells me, well, you know, your findings are speculation, which is kind of an intelligence function, is telling people what they know to be true is false. And in any case, I walked out of there and I didn't come back. And the lesson of this is that every single person who walks in there bushy-tailed and bright-eyed was going to face the same thing. They're going to be told, you're going to take a lot of money in your pocket if you go along with this, with the thesis that we hold here. And whatever you call that, that is the New York Times. Now, the last thing I want to say, because I've taken up a lot of time, gentlemen, and please forgive me, I wanted to make one good point. The New York Times is, by any measure, the most successful intelligence operation that ever took place. And it only requires anybody to do a single bit of fact checking, and you come up with what I believe is the most important article, certainly the most important freelance article that's ever been published in the United States, which was Carl Bernstein's piece in the Rolling Stone, October '77, which revealed that basically all of the relationships between the Central Intelligence Agency and all of the major networks. Basically, following these direct, and a friend of mine, a guy by the name of Bill Pepper, who wrote about the murder of Dr. King, etc. He had a piece of information. He said that the Times keeps 12 seats for CIA, direct relationship. And I'm sure we all know that Friedman was an intern at the CIA before he became the world's biggest columnist. Excuse me. Yes, that's right. In any case, in summation, is there any journalism whatsoever going on in the United States? Well, Pacifica used to do it, but Pacifica also got money from the same operation, from the Ford Foundation. That's how we created Democracy Now! Oh.
All right. Well, let me, and George, of course, who you're referring to earlier was the famous journalist George Selby's.
Thank you.
Who basically interviewed Lenin, he interviewed Mussolini, he interviewed von Hindenburg during World War I, before we actually came into the war. And he was chastised, brought up by McCarthy and pilloried. But let's get back to the scene here. At least of this part of the show. And thank you, Matthew, for that lengthy exposition. I knew once I saw you come on, we'd expect you to come in there with a pretty articulate discussion there. Let me bring Dennis in. Dennis, I'd like to hear your opinion of the news stories of the year. You have to unmute, Dennis. Dennis,
okay. First of all, I agree with Matthew. I would add one thing. It's the narrative that is being controlled by all the news stories. And what is the narrative? We are in a systemic crisis. Well, multiple crises. The whole system is failing. I agree with Noam Chomsky and other people. The United States is a failed state. And we are in revolutionary times that nobody talks about. And the crisis it's catastrophic because of global warming on top of a pandemic, on top of a crisis of capitalism. And that's what we're dealing with. And you don't hear it, except, some place like Monthly Review or some places on the left. But even they are not necessarily critical. Well, some of them are critical about the system, but the system has to be replaced. I knew this 50 years ago in the 70s, that the system has to change. The problem is the system. And you can put a name to it, it's capitalism. That is the problem. Capitalism is dysfunctional. Capitalism is dying, and socialism is not being born at this point. So we're right in the middle of of a crisis that can't be solved given where people's heads are at in terms of their awareness. No, I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Michael, chime in there. Mike? Michael, your thoughts?
Again, getting back to the top stories of the year, if anybody can remember what the stories were that that he enumerated on CNN News. And by the way, this is, I know he was doing the top media stories, but I think it's indicative that, first of all, the first 4 stories he talked about were really fall under the level of entertainment almost, including that about the royal family. It's a matter of big noise on stairs, no one at home, and reminds me of that spoof of the New York Post that was put out about 40 years ago, which they called the Post New York Post, and it was a satirical newspaper, and the headline said, "Kaboom! It's World War III. Michael Jackson, 80 million others killed."
Very well. Very well.
This has been the state of media. I mean, the reason I left journalism and left investigative reporting almost as soon as I got into it was because there was nowhere to print the good stuff anymore, except on Hartford Current at that time, and foreign publications outside the United States. But what I noticed was more disturbing about the top 10 stories, and of course these were the breaking news stories or something, is if you look at how many of them dealt with the environment, climate change, global warming, the wildfires, the ice shelf breaking off, very few of them. And again, they weren't really covered as extensively as they should have been at the time. So this is a real problem that we're facing as a species, because, and particularly in the United States, because we don't really cover the important stuff and the long-term stuff. I mean, how many of these things, these stories would matter? Some of them perhaps, if we were faced with the fact that the environment would become unlivable for human life in, let's say, the next 10 years. You know, it really is indicative as far as the top 10 stories. I think that some of the climate change, some of the environmental challenges should have been up there at least. And I would say from a, this doesn't really have to do with the top actual journalistic stories, but I'd say 2 issues, let's say philosophical issues that should be covered. And this, you can talk about the political sense and the what system we have to get rid of, and you can go back and forth about that. But I think what we're faced with now are the dearth of 2 of the more positive elements of human nature, the dearth of common sense and the dearth of empathy that we're dealing with now. And I think those 2 ideas are things that that's going to affect us on all of these issues. We saw it in January 6th. We see it in the denial of people who don't want to wear masks and are inconsiderate of other people's freedoms if it inconveniences their own. We see it in all these things, but it basically comes down to most of the world, and particularly the United States, seems to be lacking in common sense. They have put no value on common sense and very little value on empathy. And I'll leave it at that for now.
That's interesting. Empathy and common sense as part of the lead stories of the year, or the lack of. That's interesting. And then, of course, I'd throw China in the mix. I'd throw Afghanistan in the mix. Part of what you talked about, or he talked about, was Afghanistan as a top story, which I do agree with. But
thank you, Dave. Thank you, Michael. Very well stated.
Yeah. Let me just share this. This is from yesterday's NewsHour. One of the things, look at the kind of debates we're having in the United States here about their arguments about critical race theory, these attacks on down at the state and local levels, around the country, people teaching about slavery, etc. This is dealing with the approach to history in Russia. And for somebody, I've been around friends of mine who've gone and benefited from Glasnost. They were doing their dissertations or writing their books, and there was this episodic release and closure, release and closure, release and closure of documents that had to do with the former policies and domestic characteristics of the Soviet Union. And this story deals yesterday with a Supreme Court decision in Moscow that had to do with the folks that were trying to institutionalize the new documents, the memories of the Soviet Union, and of course, talking about the not so good or not so pleasing aspects of Soviet domestic policy and foreign policy. So let me just share this with you. This is the NewsHour yesterday, about a 5 to 6 minute piece.
Reported today, Russia's highest court ordered the country's most prominent human rights organization closed. The umbrella group, Memorial, documents today's Russian political prisoners, but also decades of Soviet human rights atrocities. As Nick Schifrin reports, the ruling comes almost exactly 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union and is part of the Kremlin's battle over history.
Inside Russia's Supreme Court, the verdict was swift. A Russian judge ordered 3 decades of historical and human rights work, quote, liquidated. Outside, supporters of Memorial yelled, "There is no law." Police showed whose law runs today's Russia. Memorial came together as the Soviet Union was falling apart. It was the late 80s, and Nobel Peace Prize winner and human rights activist Andrei Sakharov, who'd been exiled by previous Soviet leaders and celebrated by American officials, teamed up with then-Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. The goal, document the truth about Soviet repression and collect the memories of millions of people who were marched to their death and forced to work in Soviet gulags, a history that Memorial says today's Russia is trying to erase.
All the branches of Memorial were very active, opposing the attempts of authorities to forget about the repressions of Soviet times.
Anna Dobrovolskaya directs the sister organization Memorial Human Rights. It documents today's political prisoners, including main opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who's been labeled the equivalent of Al-Qaeda.
Russia is a not very safe place right now. We have seen the list of people like former governors or former political leaders who have been recently arrested, and these numbers are growing.
Memorial Human Rights tracks the unprecedented crackdown on Russian civil society and media, and itself expects to be shut down by the same court tomorrow.
It sends a very clear signal to the other human rights organizations that they should be somehow more careful with what they say or what kind of campaigns they're running. And of course, a lot of people interpret it in a way that the memory about repressions is being targeted.
Gorbachev was willing to acknowledge the memory of those Soviet repressions. It fit his policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, as he tried to reform the Soviet Union. His effort failed 30 years ago this past weekend, when on Christmas Day 1991, he ended his presidency and with it, the Soviet Union itself. There had been years of pressure, pro-democracy protests across Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, calls for economic reform in part driven by miners all over the Soviet Union, and calls for democracy within against the Communist Party. By 1991, Russian Federation President Boris Yeltsin confronted Gorbachev, and in December, Yeltsin and the leaders of Belarus and Ukraine created the Commonwealth of Independent States. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin calls the Soviet Union's demise the century's greatest geopolitical catastrophe, and he blames the West, especially NATO, for rubbing salt in the wound.
Not 1 inch to the east is what we were told in the 1990s. And what happened? We were duped. We didn't come to the borders of the US or the UK. You came to us. Now you're telling us that Ukraine will also be in NATO.
Putin frames today's crisis on the borders of Ukraine, where the US says 100,000 Russian troops are ready to invade, as a product of historic Western wrongs. He demands NATO reverse its own historical promises and reject Ukrainian membership. But in Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky is trying to write a new future with the West.
Ukraine's membership in NATO is a matter between Ukraine and the alliance, and definitely not the choice of any other country anywhere in the world.
And joining me now from Moscow is Vladislav Zubak, professor of international history at the London School of Economics and author most recently of Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union. Welcome to the NewsHour. Let's start with today's news. Why do you think Memorial International and presumably tomorrow Memorial Human Rights are being targeted?
Memorial stands for the clear language of denunciation of Stalinist past and terrorist past of the Soviet state. President Vladimir Putin got interested in history himself, but he got interested in history in a very specific, very instrumental way. He was particularly passionate about the story of the outbreak of the Second World War and the responsibility of the Soviet Union for that outbreak. If you read the documents that Memorial collected, you built a sort of a line that links the terror and the rise of Stalinism to the rise of totalitarianism in Europe and the outbreak of the war. And this is the story that the authorities don't like and Putin does not agree with.
Vladimir Putin talks about the war often, and the war is used across segments of society. Why is that competition for the narrative over World War II so important?
Putin, when he became the president, he gradually but very purposefully began to resurrect the symbols of heroic past, particularly zeroing on the victory in the Second World War, which he always calls the Great Patriotic War, somewhat omitting that unpleasant episode from 1939 to 1941, when, the Soviet Union was an ally of Nazi Germany. And many millions of Russians somehow ambivalent between, realization, thanks to Memorial, that it was a very costly war and the regime was enormously repressive and millions lost their relatives, and the fact that somehow it was instrumentalized and justified by the complete victory of 1945. And I think the leadership realizes this is sort of the last and the most important peg on which you can hang the new identity, post-Soviet identity, linking it to the old one and at the same time not completely returning to it.
What do you believe the lessons are that Putin has taken from the collapse of the Soviet Union and implemented through his policies today?
Well, first lesson that he learned was a fiscal and financial lesson. Always have the money, because you always need the money when some kind of economic or political crisis or just instability sets in. The second lesson I think he learned from Gorbachev and Yeltsin, never project the image of indecisiveness and inability to use power. And this is the image that Gorbachev left, remarkably, among the Russians, because he had all the power, he just didn't use this power, he didn't know what to do with it. And of course, never allow the opposition to speculate on the past of Stalinist crimes and so on and so forth, on the existing problems, and above all, never allow the opposition to find allies in the West. Because this is exactly what happened in 1989-91. You find amazing coalitions between Russian Democrats and Yeltsin at the time, and, for instance, American Republican right in the United States, or some kind of Baltic nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists. So those transnational coalitions were used to devastating effectiveness to unseat Gorbachev. And Putin is aware of this lesson.
How does that inform, or how does that connect to the kind of crackdown that we've seen even today against Memorial?
So for him, it's a geostrategic problem. It's a struggle for a European security order. And in this struggle, the past is a very important weapon. If you accept Memorial's version, the Soviet Union and Russia, as a successor to the Soviet Union, must adopt the same kind of policy as Germany adopted, always repenting, always asking for forgiveness to everyone who they call invaded, repressed, and so on and so forth, and in the same time sort of accepting a marginal and repentant position in the new European order. And this is what incenses him. I believe. And he finds the history of Stalinism as a weapon in the arms of his enemies.
Where does that leave the West today? What should the West understand about the lessons that Putin has taken from the end of the Cold War?
If you move NATO, or that, and declare that this NATO would be enlarged forever, you have a conflict. The only kind of tool he sees is moving troops along the Russian border and trying to send this powerful signal to the West.
Ukrainian officials, today's U.S. government, Western European and NATO officials would say that it is today's Russia, that it is more aggressive by massing those troops on Ukraine's border, and that it is Putin's misinterpretation of history and, frankly, of NATO's intentions today that has increased tensions.
Yes, and this is
all right. So let me just finish
why Putin became so interested in history. He tries to interpret history in his own way. So we are in the battle of over the past, but I would say as historians, let's continue to fight over the past rather than to fight on the ground. It's what, Churchill or somebody would famously say, jaw, 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 not war, war, war.
Vladislav Zubak, thank you very much.
All right. And that was yesterday on the NewsHour, the issue of the politicization of history. I know that Putin has particularly taken aim at the issue of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. They've actually suppressed the documents that assert that, which is common knowledge historically. I mean, they actually had dumped a whole bunch of documents talking about the negotiations between Hitler, between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and then they repressed it. But anyway, let me bring Steve on here. Steve, what's your impression of all this discussion of history and politics? You got on mute, Steve. You got on mute. Can't hear you yet.
There we are, I think.
Yeah,
Right?
there we are. Yeah, we are. We are, right.
Yeah. Well, Jim, first let me say I can't stay on too long. I've been a little ill and I'm getting very tired. But a lot to dispute with Professor Zubak. And I take a completely opposite view from him, and it would take me probably as long to explain it as it took him to explain his view. But I have written frequently on what I call the 75 Years War against the Soviet Union, which was successful in the end. It started the day after the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917, when Churchill began, as the British Home Secretary, began to organize what was called the intervention on the side of the anti-communists in what became the Soviet Union in those days, which included a unit from the United States Army, which landed and then stayed in Vladivostok. This war went on for quite some time, and it was successful. When he talks about the Soviet Union being an ally of Nazi Germany in 1939 to 1941, the Soviet Union spent the bulk of the time in the 1930s trying to persuade the Western powers, particularly Germany and particularly Britain and France, to join in an alliance against Hitler. One example was at the time of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union stood ready to come to the immediate aid of the Czech army, which was fairly strong at that time itself. In fact, on the night that Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, there were Soviet planes warming up on airfields just on the other side of the Czech border to fly over Czechoslovakia to help the Czechs repel the German invasion. It's very well documented that the reason for the Nazi-Soviet pact was that Britain and France refused to join in an alliance with the Soviet Union against Germany. At the last, everybody knew that the German invasion of Poland was coming. It was virtually announced. The Soviet Union said they would join with the Western powers to oppose it, but in order to do that, they had to put troops into Poland. The last thing that the right-wing government of Poland wanted was Soviet troops on its soil, and we know what the history was. To say that the Soviet Union wasn't a lie of Nazi Germany when they lost about 26 million dead in the Second World War is ridiculous. I won't go into a lot of the other stuff that this man talked about, but it's very interesting. He's he's an anti-Soviet Russian. I'm not a fan of Putin, but he's also an anti-Putin Russian. I don't know where his base is, but that's one more thing in terms of battling the Nazis in the 1930s. The only non-Spanish power that came to the aid of the elected Spanish Republican government in Spain was that of the Soviet Union. Britain refused, France refused, Roosevelt stood, hid behind the Neutrality Act. If the Spanish Republican government had been able to get any kind of weaponry from the West, it is reasonably thought, it can't be shit, never know what happens in war, but they would have had a much better chance. They held off the fascists for close to 2.5 years, but with weaponry, they might have done a much better job. But it was the Soviet Union that supported the elected democratic Spanish Republican government, and Britain and France let the Nazis run all over them. There's a lot more to talk about this, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say I'll wait for a few minutes to hear responses to what I have to say, but then I'm going to have to bail out, Jim.
Well, thank you, Steve, as always. And of course, these issues you raise are part of the equation. And looking at this, the fact that the Soviet contribution to the victory in World War II is always minimized in the West. But let me bring Dennis in. Dennis, can you unmute, Dennis? Dennis, can you unmute, please? Dennis, just unmute there so we can hear your thoughts about this issue. And as we're waiting for Dennis, Michael, can you unmute? Mike? Yeah, go on. Sure, you might go first then.
Yeah, basically, I just have to say that there's a saying in Russia that goes, once KGB, always KGB. And Putin was a very effective member of the KGB. Yeah, Steve, I got now. Well, let me just finish, Dennis.
Yeah, let Mike finish. Go on.
You can say, you could talk about the history and what the reasons were, and maybe they were just pragmatic reasons that it allied with that the Soviet Union allied with Nazi Germany in 1930 with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. But the fact is that for whatever reason, they did it. They did it. I mean, you could also say that the Chamberlain government was not necessarily pro-Nazi. There were apparently some many people in the government who were not that opposed to the Nazis, but for whatever reasons, and there were people who try to justify it by saying the Army and the Navy and the RAF were not ready at that time to tackle a war, and there were all these reasons. But the fact is, they did have a policy of appeasement. And the Soviet Union did ally with Nazi Germany. When I say ally, they had a pact with Nazi Germany. And when they went into Poland and occupied half of Poland, you could say it was in part to prevent the Nazis from grabbing it. But there were instances in which a lot of, for instance, Polish officers disappeared. And I know that there's controversy about that. But the fact is, the Soviet Union did not do it out of benevolence for Poland, for the most part. They did do it. The fact of the matter is, they then, in 1941, when they were invaded by Germany, they turned around and they fought the good fight, and they did a massive job in defeating Nazi Germany in the East. They were the only country, there was not an alliance of countries fighting on the Eastern Front against Nazi Germany. Although they were not fighting the Japanese, but they still were the only power fighting them. They did a marvelous job. But countries come around and do the right thing, but they may have made severe mistakes or done the wrong thing beforehand. To destroy documents that dealt with that, to destroy that history, to liquidate documents dealing with the transgressions and the wrongs that were done by their own regime. Britain doesn't deny. You don't see British historians and the British government denying the appeasement of the Chamberlain government prior to 1939. You don't see, I mean, you are beginning to see it in the United States with these taking any books off the shelf in Texas that have to do with critical race theory or the 1619 Project. Yeah, we are seeing a lot of that in the United States, but at least we don't destroy documents that relate to slavery, at least not yet, and Jim Crow, etc. In other words, and we don't deny the fact that the United States military was segregated during the Second World War when they were fighting, supposedly fighting against racism. The fact is that you don't justify yourself by eliminating any wrongdoing that the country might have done. You don't raise the country. What you are really doing is condemning the country to fall back into that wrongdoing, very possibly, at least. And I think that's what he's doing. The liquidation of documents. They didn't come out and put out a statement saying we disagree with these documents, etc. They said these documents of Memorial will be liquidated. They didn't justify it by saying Memorial is fake news. You know, its standards, investigative standards, were not scientific, were not in keeping with historical analysis. They just liquidated them. And if you liquidate your history, sooner or later, you're going to liquidate your country. And the fact of the matter is, right now, I'm even saying to myself, well, in a few years, I mean, once these things are liquidated, we can't even trust any history that comes out of Russia. We can't trust it. If I were writing even something about the Second World War or what happened before it, I can't use what will remain after this of Russian historical documents because it's not history. It's political. It's politicized documents. So I think this is a very seriously disturbing and counterproductive for Russia's standing in the world, at least. It's a counterproductive act they did, and perhaps an act of desperation by Putin, or perhaps simply a means of grabbing power, not necessarily the way the Soviet Union was meant to be, or by the dictates of communism, but by the dictates of Stalinism. And Stalinism was a distortion. I mean, in other words, technically speaking, he was doing communism, but it was communism that was no longer even dictatorship by the masses. It was dictatorship of a dictator. And if he wants to return to that, that will be the most massive step backwards that Russia has taken. And I can see what happened at the fall of the Soviet Union when the Soviet people rose up against it. I can see that happening again, although what the outcome will be this time, I don't know. But this is a serious, serious transgression on the part of Putin's government.
All right. Steve, I know you have to go. Why don't you have your last words on this? You said you were going to leave a little early. Steve, you want to respond?
Well, yeah, I agree with the previous speakers on the condemnation of Putin. Putin is a well-known, he's a kleptomaniac. He heads a kleptocracy. He is reputed to be the richest man in the world, $200 billion, I've heard, for his personal. Well, of course, now he's been outpaced by what's the Tesla guy. Yeah, he has a lot of money. He stays in power by favoring oligarchs who also have a lot of money. You know, Russia is essentially a capitalist country that has the government. You know, in Western capitalist countries, there's sort of there are contests over who control. They're all capitalists, but they're different. contests over who controls the government. But in Russia, there is no contest. The government is there to protect Putin and his friends. So I'm certainly no supporter of Putin. I do think he's got a legitimate gripe about NATO wanting to move into Ukraine, but Ukraine has been a problem for the Soviet Union and before it for Russia going back centuries. It's a very long-term problem. I mean, remember that there was a European war fought in part of Ukraine in 1855. It's called the Crimean War. So, this goes back way before 1917. So I'm certainly no friend of, I'm not in any way an admirer of Putin. And I agree with Mike that it is extremely unfortunate that documents are being destroyed. And there's a huge, or was anyway, a huge store of documents in Russia. Actually, I have a friend who does work with Russian documents and finds, interestingly enough, in them data which has a more positive view of what Stalin and the Soviet government was doing to protect itself during the 1930s, and then to play a major factor in winning the war in the 1940s. After that, I'm not an admirer of Stalin or what his successors did in terms of eventually running down the Soviet Union. And with that, gentlemen, I am going to bid you adieu.
Well, thank you.
And
Thank you,
see you next week.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Steve, as always. Dennis, your comments. Dennis,
And Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Same to you.
We salute you, Steve.
Dennis, your comments about all this.
My comment. Well, I essentially agree with Steve Jonas. You've got all these internal contradictions within Russia that we have to deal with. And at the same time, the U.S. imperialism has broken the agreements that they had with the Soviet Union. They moved NATO right up to the borders of the Soviet Union. So we're having it's like if the U.S. wanted to actually see the Soviet Union and Russia as enemies, they wouldn't lie all the time and ignore the reality. That's what I think. But also they're in a crisis too. So we have countries like Russia and the United States are both in, I would say, mortal crisis mode. That's what we're dealing with. I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Let me bring on Matthew. Matthew, your comments about all this. What do you think about the situation vis-a-vis? You heard the piece. What did you think about the piece, but also the issue of history? And of course, Orwell. That's why Orwell wrote 1984. I mean, 1984 is based on his reaction to living in England during World War II, and then ruminating on the Cold War as it develops after World War II. But Matthew, why don't you unmute and give us your thoughts about all this?
I'm trying to unmute.
You're there, man. Go on.
You're successful.
You're successful.
Yeah, you're successful.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay. I can't see the screen. I pushed the button, but I can think. Or the rumor has it in any case. Well, I mean, actually, I enjoy the history part of the whole story. I read an excellent book on a biography of Trotsky by Deutscher, which I highly recommend. I only got through the first of the 3 books.
Yeah, great biography. Great biography. Go on.
Well, supposedly the best biography ever written in the English language. Somebody speculated. All right. Putin is well. Yeah, first let me hit on this Ukraine Russia thing. I'm sure we are all aware of the origins of Russia came from Ukraine. There is such a close tie between the two. They're in a cultural manner. There's little ability to distinguish from the two because of the ancient ties and the et cetera, this kind of stuff. And so the question of whether the United States is going to colonize Ukraine or not is a fundatory or foundational, if that's the correct term, issue in Russia. That means Russia is getting smaller if it loses Ukraine. We also are aware that it was more or less a coup d'etat that the United States had engineered. We remember back when the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine was playing footsie with the far right.
Yeah, the Orange Revolution in Kiev.
Well, I'm sure you're correct, but it makes it sound, yes, it was a fake. To my recollection, it was entirely created by the United States, that revolution. And please correct me, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, because I speak with doubt about that because I didn't study it very closely. But yeah, I don't know if the Soviet Union, Russia is collapsing. I think the authoritarian system is working fairly well there to a degree, and when they go out and they destroy an immense amount of history, it reminds me of what the United States does. And basically, if the United States doesn't do what it does, who knows what would have happened? Certainly, Putin is an old intelligence guy. But then again, do you remember the last American president who wasn't either promoted by intelligence or actually a member of it? Reagan was an FBI plant, if you recall, even when he was at the Actors Union, the Screen Actors Guild. This is going back to the 40s. So intelligence and politics are not distinguished in the United States per se. I haven't heard of an election that was carried out and reported in any significant manner in the last, well, since I've been able to vote. But my experience, I was only in Moscow once, and it was the Soviet Union at the time, but it was at the end of its period there. The exchange rate was really good, and I don't know, I went to one of the early private restaurants. I don't, as you can see, my knowledge of having anything of value to say about the Russia is kind of limited. The last time I was looking at Russia was when a professor by the name of Stephen, I don't even remember his damn last name. He was married to
Stephen Cohen. Stephen Cohen.
Yeah, Stephen Cohen. His wife is the
Katrina Vanden Heuvel.
Katrina, right? Who comes from interesting origins herself, and Cohen was calling the issue with the Russia to be the new Cold War, and I thought I had possession of that expression because my reporting from North Korea and my subsequent reporting about the so-called neocons, who are all anti-ballistic missile lobbyists, I thought that was the new Cold War between the US and North Korea. But of course, it was a false one because North Korea doesn't have enough dynamite to blow its nose over there. But it did serve to extract a few $1 trillion from American taxpayers for the ABM systems. I don't want to get too far from the topic, but the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet, I'm saying the Soviet Union, and Russia again and again is, I believe it reveals that the United States has basically pissed away its defense budget into the pockets of various lobbyists and con men and corporations that are collapsing in such a manner that they won't be able to address a Russian military operation, and that's kind of what the Russians are pointing out by arming right on the Ukraine border. There was a time when the United States could have downgraded its conflict with Russia, and the United States intelligence agencies, which again I don't distinguish from the White House, or for that matter, substantially from the parties, they decided that they're going to take the hard line and basically go against the deal with Gorbachev, which said they're not going to keep picking off these Warsaw Pact, former Warsaw Pact countries, and keep putting weapons closer and closer to the heart of Russia. Now, Jim, could you point me exactly to the main question that is outstanding on this topic? I'm hitting around the outskirts.
Well, no, you're sort of dealing with it. The question, they were complaining and bringing up the issue of the control of history, and how the control of history, of course, is important to socialize a population. I mean, we see that in the United States all the time. The control of history, these battles we're having about slavery, etc., are equivalent of what is going on in Russia. And then the specific thing was that he had shut down a outfit that was set up at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that essentially was retaining the actual documents that they got and dug out over all the crimes of Stalin. I mean, like, frankly, they published amazing stuff. It's funny because I know somebody who's writing a 4-volume work on the fighting in early 1943 to April in the Soviet Union. He's been going back and forth and researching the Soviet Union for 50 years of his life. And he tells me that in terms of the military information that they're releasing, he can get whatever he wants. So it's pretty clear that even the embarrassing military information that deals with all the different calculations, miscalculations of Stalin. And when you look at the discussions of World War II that they've come up with, Stalin is really micromanaging the war really carefully. He's calling up these army commanders. So, they're talking about, how Putin, of course, is a nationalist, an ultra-nationalist, and he feels justifiably hoodwinked and angered by his watching a power that was truly formidable collapse. And so here he is saying, well, I want a certain type of history argued for that'll, not attack the ideas we have for perpetuating our power. And that's basically what we're talking about, this piece in the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour tonight.
Okay, well, I mean, one of the countries that I spent less time addressing was really the Soviet Union, which I continues to use the term because it's very hard for me to stop using it, because that's the country that exists there now. Its formative role was as the Soviet Union. The fact that Putin, who is an intelligence guy, rose up. I mean, let me go back to another intelligence coup, if we may. I'm trying to remember. Was it Yuri Andropov was the head of the KGB?
He was indeed. He was. That's right. He was the head of the KGB, right?
And I remember at the time I ran a news agency out of Albany, and I took advantage of that moment. It was around the time of George Bush Sr. Was running for president. Year must have been 88 or so, I presume. But I was doing this stuff long before that, so I can't remember what year it was. In any case, I made a cartoon, review that they sent Bush over to the funeral of was it Brezhnev that brought on Andropov, and he's shaking hands with Andropov, and the byline or the line under the cartoon was Reagan is dead, and Bush, new President Bush goes over to shake hands with Andropov. I mean, it wasn't true. Reagan was still alive, but the point was that the intelligence operations have been operating countries or city-states or whatever you want to call these things for quite a while. I mentioned earlier, even Reagan was an FBI. What's the term? He was basically taking his orders from the FBI.
He was an informant. He was an informant when he was head of the Screen Actors Guild. It's
The term is rat. He was a rat.
He was worse than that. Basically, he sold the pension of all the screen actors in his union in exchange for God knows what he got. I don't know, a pet horse or something. And basically, he was much more than a rat. He was an absolute turncoat. He went in and he undermined the entire Screen Actors Guild because the television was just coming into its own, and all of these guys had done movies, and there was a negotiation to determine how much. What the hell is that big entity that Katrina's grandfather started, Mr. Stein? Anyway, the big agency and later production company that pretty much controlled Hollywood, they made a deal with Reagan when he was the chief of the Screen Actors Guild, and basically that deal was how much royalties are these screen actors going to get when we start putting their movies on TV. And I believe they ended up making a deal with Reagan that they would pay nothing to those screen actors. It was one of the biggest coups in the history of a union. But we must give Reagan his due. His first film, he actually performed very well. He was able
actually, though, a point of information there. What he did is he cooperated. First of all, he cooperated with the House Un-American Activities Committee. A lot of the blacklisting that was going on there, the Red Scare and the UAC stuff, was used by the industry as union busting. So the idea was to get people off of the SAG boards and SAG board and the after board, was dealing with television and radio. And to basically, if they were blacklisted as communists, they couldn't serve on the board, and then the union could get its way. Reagan was very complicit in that. And you're absolutely right that he sold out, but they were working in concerts and using the red baiting, the Red Scare, and the House and the HUAC hearings to do that, which Reagan also cooperated with. At the time, though, it was at least technically, I mean, he was a member of the Democratic Party. But that has nothing to do with anything, as it turned out.
Well, he actually was a popular fronter for a while during the war, Ronald Reagan.
I'm sorry, a popular what?
A popular fronter during the war. And what you're referring to is Katrina Vanden Heuvel's parents, who ran the Music Corporation of America.
Right.
But I also want Kenny to have the last word here. So let me just let Kenny come in and, share his points of view about what he thinks about all this. Come on, Ken.
You're talking about Putin eliminating.
Well,
Bernie?
we're talking about, we've been ranging through a lot of different issues.
No, I'm not an historian. I don't.
Right. Well,
I have trouble trying to remember the phone number where I grew up. That's it.
I have it right here.
Okay.
All right. We'll share it with you. Anyway, on that note, this is the Wednesday, December 29th edition of Going Viral, GoingViral.news. We had on today Ken Aaron, California. We had Steve Janos with us, Michael Jankowitz, Dennis Goldstein, myself, Jim Dingeman, and we had a surprise having Matthew Reiss join us. And we want to thank you and stay tuned.
And Happy New Year.